Mato. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this ANZ webinar. I'm Lorraine Mapu. I'm the Managing Director of Business at ANZ New Zealand. And today I'm delighted to be joined by our Chief Economist, Sharon Zollner, who is in the beautiful Waikato today. Our focus today, with Sharon's help, is to look at the current economic environment and talk about ways that businesses can navigate through the tougher times we've got ahead as a country. I'd like to take this opportunity to especially acknowledge anyone who has joined us from one of those regions that's been overwhelmingly affected by the cyclone. Our thoughts are with you, and I know the ANZ teams have been doing their best to support you. Before we get into it, just a reminder that the webinar will run until about midday today. It's being recorded, so we'll follow up with a link to the recording afterwards. So look, one of our priorities is to deliver timely expertise and insights to support Kiwi businesses to build and grow strong, financially sustainable businesses. When we set the date for this webinar, no one could have predicted the severe weather events that have caused so much devastation and disruption to many communities. Grappling with what's happened, I think, the disruption that many communities have had around the North Island, piling onto an economy already hit with high inflation and interest rate pressures. And it's clear that the scale of the impact to roading and infrastructure is affecting areas and will be felt by communities and businesses and supply chains for some time yet. So while the immediate needs of our business customers have been about safety first, it's been quickly followed by having to be able to pay their workers and getting access to cash. And as our CEO, Antonia Watson, has said, we need to make it easy for our customers when everything else is really hard at the moment. And if I think about when we look back over these past few weeks, we had customers calling out to us. One of the biggest challenges was, how do I pay wages? I've got no power, no access to anything. How do I get wages paid? And the teams were able to facilitate wages payment on next to no information. And so, we're really doubling down on trying to support customers through. So when we look back, I think over the last few years, when businesses have been disrupted, we've really learnt a lot. The pandemic and those most recent events have been a stark reminder of the importance of being financially prepared for business disruption. And being prepared acts as a buffer when the unexpected happens and helps us navigate changing business environments. And if I think back to COVID, one of the things a lot of our customers did was actually, after the first lockdown, realise that actually having some cash in reserves is key critical. So perhaps instead of utilising cash, it may have been to, grow the business or to even pay down debt. Customers said, actually, it's really valuable to have some cash in reserves. So look, when you registered for today's session, you told us what your biggest challenges are for the next 12 months. And sitting at the top of your concerns are, three things: escalating costs, finding quality employees, and high interest rates. So, if I think about escalating costs, one of the big things to do is really get deep into your P&Ls, look at your profit and loss, and really go through those line items in fine detail, looking for opportunities to stop cost escalating. So, there's a lot for us to think about, but what I want to do is I'm going to get Sharon to just give you some insights into what's happening in the economy. So, Sharon, I'm going to hand over to you to provide those insights for us.
Great, thanks very much, Lorraine. Yeah, so there's obviously an awful lot going on, and frankly, economists could talk for hours about this stuff, but we've got about 20 minutes. So I'll give a bit of a flavour of what's going on, and then we do have an opportunity for Q&A at the end. So inflation, as you can see in this chart, it's been a global phenomenon. It really has exploded everywhere at all the same time, which makes sense because essentially we all had the same shock, COVID. We all had more or less the same policy response, which was a huge fiscal spend up, particularly on the likes of wage subsidies and other income support, and massive monetary stimulus. So interest rates cut to the bone. Talk about negative rates. Many countries did go negative. Bond yields were negative for a long time, and a lot of money printing partly to facilitate the fiscal response, so the government didn't have to borrow a lot of money really fast, which is obviously a business we have to tell you is an expensive way to do things. But also just generally to stimulate the economy and loosen monetary conditions. Yeah, it worked. We saw asset prices around the world do very, very well, whether that's equities, commercial property, or in New Zealand, of course, the single most important asset is housing. We had the biggest housing boom in our history. And now we're on the other side of that, which is not nearly so fun. But you can see that we haven't got the highest inflation, looking at countries we often compare ourselves to, but not the lowest either. Other countries have had more of a spike and then a drop, and that's related to their exposure generally to the Russia invasion of Ukraine and the energy shock that came with that. So we missed the worst, but it's also fair to say we are a little short on evidence that inflation's falling. It hit 7.2, 7.3 basically and has plateaued since then. So it's not looking so much like a spike as a plateau at this point. Of course, we're all forecasting it to obediently drop away, but that is for now just a forecast. So in terms of what's driving inflation, it's pretty much a mix of both imported or at least tradable inflation, which is anything you can put on a boat, whether it's actually been on a boat or not. That's the light blue, and non-tradable. So the classic non-tradable is the price of a haircut. So it's going to reflect things like wage growth, inflation expectations, and rents. So that's the sort of inflation the Reserve Bank thinks it can actually do something about. It also tends to be stickier, more slow moving. The only other big jump up there you can see is in 2010, that was GST hike. Whereas the tradable inflation tends to wash through quite quickly. So central banks tend to prefer to just ignore that and let it do its thing. That tends to be caused by things like oil prices, exchange rate movements, that sort of thing. But you can see both are really high and both are looking really sticky. So in theory, goods inflation should fall quite quickly, but the services inflation is picking up. So that those haircuts and the non-tradable inflation is looking pretty stuck. So we actually put out an insight note today on how globally inflation, it was all goods inflation. So there was this lovely idea that it was all transitory and it would all wash out as soon as COVID faded into the background. Well, COVID has faded into the background, but inflation is still here. And the services inflation, the non-tradable inflation, those sort of sticky, the wage inflation, those bits that once they really get going are a bit harder to stop. That inflation in many countries, including New Zealand, is still going up. And that is a big problem for central banks. So we've had the mad scramble to right-size interest rates and get them remotely close to where they should be. Now we're sort of going into the fine-tuning stage. So we've seen a decrease in the size of hikes. So in New Zealand, the Reserve Bank was doing triple hikes. Now the last one was a double hike. Yeah, that's pretty cold comfort if you've got a large mortgages and that they're only doing double hikes at a time when house prices are down more than 15%. Honestly, I feel bad that we didn't forecast this, but if you'd told me we would be in that situation, I would have said you were mad. So we are in a very, very strange situation in a whole number of ways, but that inflation is the most important because it is a situation we haven't been in since, well, for 30 years. And so accordingly, there's an awful lot of uncertainty around how easy it's going to be to get out of this situation. How much does the Reserve Bank need to do to slow the economy down? Have they already overdone it? But secondly, how much of a slowdown in the economy is going to be needed to get inflation down? There's lots of question marks around that as well. So you'll hear me talking about risks a lot more in this presentation than you'll hear me talking about our actual forecasts. So if you ask firms what their biggest problems is, and this is from our fabulous Business Outlook survey, firms are still saying that their biggest problem is finding skilled labour. Slightly less in Q4 than in Q3, but still right up there, followed by regulation and paperwork, followed by high wage rates, followed by all the other costs. Those four together, that's about 2/3 weighted up of the problems that are weighing on firms, small businesses' minds. So those four problems either cause inflation directly or reflect inflation. So it's really not clear, at least as at the end of last year, that the Reserve Bank had managed to open up any spare capacity in the economy, which is what you need to bring inflation down. It's things like firms realizing, oh shoot, we're stuck with a whole lot of inventory that's proving harder to shift than we expected, or Liminek, we tried to put our prices up and we got some pushback. from consumers. That's new. We're going to have to backtrack on that. Or, hey, actually, no one's our retention's better. We're not losing staff to the competition so quickly. Maybe we don't need to offer such large wage increases this year. Maybe if we put out a job ad, someone will actually apply. Those kinds of things are what brings inflation down. And there's not much sign of that yet in this data. There we go. Here's a similar question, but I like it because it goes all the way back to 1969. This is asking firms, what is preventing you from expanding your production? And the dark blue is labour. So basically, yeah, we could do more, we could sell more, we just can't produce anymore because we haven't got the staff. And clearly, that's obviously the case in cafes and restaurants, for example, but it is everywhere. I waited an hour and a half for my baggage yesterday at Auckland Airport. There's a lot of labour shortages everywhere. But if you look at where that is as a proportion of firms, it's around 35%. It's just off its highs. It's still higher than at any time in the 1970s, which of course was a very boom, bust, crazy, inflationary, wild time that was supposedly inflation targeting had gotten rid of those crazy days of volatility, but throw in a pandemic and here we are again. But the light blue is the normal state of affairs, demand. Like if we got a big order tomorrow, we could fill it, or even an order tomorrow, we could fill it. We're just waiting for the orders to roll in, waiting for the customers to open the door. You can see the proportion of firms who say that is their constraint is unusually low. So that's a very inflationary situation. Also compare with 2011-12, because that's when the Christchurch earthquake happened. And you can see how much spare capacity there was in the economy then. Very few firms saying they couldn't find labour. The unemployment rate was over 6%. The construction sector really had not recovered from the global financial crisis. Indeed, we'd had a double dip recession in 2010. Whereas now, the construction sector is very downbeat about the outlook, but right here, right now, still pretty busy. And of course, the unemployment rate is 3.4. So the Reserve Bank is forecasting the unemployment rate to rise in a very similar way to it did when the global financial crisis hit. And from the get-go, I don't know about you, but it doesn't feel like the GFC to me. Perhaps if you're a residential property developer, it might feel a bit like that. But otherwise, it doesn't feel that way. So, our forecasts are not that different. We've also got the unemployment rate rising fast. But if it doesn't rise that fast, well, obviously, while that's good news for the people who don't lose their jobs, it would mean that the Reserve Bank is likely to keep on raising rates by more. The central banks don't like to talk about the NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, because when they do, it makes it sound like they want people to lose their jobs. Of course, basically the PAR unemployment rate has got nothing to do with monetary policy. It's going to depend on things like our health system, our mental health system, where benefits are set, how easy it is to hire and fire people, how easily workers can move between sectors, our education system, how well that's matching skills to the needed skills, immigration, all of these things. The monetary policy just has to sort of estimate what it is and run with it. But the upshot is that on their current forecast, even though they've got a very aggressive increase in unemployment in there, and I would say the risks are tilted towards it not rising that fast, it's still inflationary until next year. So that's part of the reason why they're quite concerned about inflation. Now, the economy is slowing, definitely, particularly that residential construction pipeline that I talked about. But also anecdotally, that households are definitely pulling back on discretionary spending. And you can see it a bit in the data though, but not that much yet. It is coming. People are rolling over onto higher mortgages, but it is taking time. Now, of course, we've got the cyclone rebuild, and we don't have a huge amount of capacity on tap to just turn on to rebuild 20, 30, 40, or however many bridges it is that we've taken out and rebuild those highways. Certainly job for life for geotechnical engineers and road workers, that much is clear. It is going to soak up resources and it will crowd out other activity. And there's a lot of residential rebuilding to do too, but and that will be insured, but the other infrastructure damages is not, of course. And now, of course, the debate about should we be spending our limited resources on climate change mitigation versus adaptation, that's clearly, going to be a ferocious debate because our resources are limited. But coming back to the labour market, you can see here, whichever measure you use, that wage growth is much higher than 2008. And that makes sense because the labour market is tighter than 2008 and inflation is higher. We've got a record high labour force participation. So the proportion of people of working age who are in or looking for paid employment is at a record high. So that's very different from the US, say, where a whole lot of people just retired early in response to COVID and haven't been able to be persuaded to come back. We are really, we're hiring teenagers now and old people. My nephew's earning, 14-year-old nephew's earning $26 an hour washing dishes in Queenstown. Living wage for him, particularly when he's living at home. My dad is driving headers for $0 an hour for my brother, but he's 83. Neither of them are officially even in the population of working age. That sort of thing's happening all over New Zealand. So there are some signs of the labour market easing up, job ads falling back, but from astronomical levels. Firms are expecting lower wage increases in the next 12 months than the last 12 months, for example. But it's the starting point is super duper tight. And the tourism rebound has added a whole lot of seasonal pressure into the labour market as well. So it's pretty murky in terms of trying to figure out the signal from the noise. But one thing's clear, and that's if you've got strong wage growth and excellent job security, then you haven't really got a reason to save for a rainy day more than you were before. That fear factor is missing. And I think that explains why spending's held up much better than confidence has. So on the left, you can see the Australian and New Zealand, similar data, not quite the same, job openings or job ads divided by the number of unemployed people. So that's just to show you how literally off the charts the labour market in both countries has been. But you can also see the job ads coming off, but they're still, only just back to trend at most. So there's that question of how much of a buffer of unmet labour demand do we have to get through before we actually start cutting into the muscle of employment and causing fear of unemployment, which is what gets people saving, really gets people cooling their jets in Adrian Orr's parlance. On the right-hand side is the immigration data. It's very, very iffy data nowadays, I'm afraid, since we got rid of departure cards, subject to huge revision. But it does make sense that both incomings and outgoings would have jumped up in response to the border finally opening. Where the net is less clear. But certainly in some sectors like agriculture, obviously it's gotten a lot easier because they're very reliant on RSE workers, for example. So we have seen a bit of a flurry in employment tensions and in monthly jobs filled, for example. But how much of that is labour demand having a renaissance versus how much of it is, there's actually some workers out there. There's maybe some point now to advertising, which would be more supply-driven demand as opposed to demand-driven supply. One of those is much more inflationary than the other. But net migration, takes a bit of heat out of the labour market potentially by adding to labour supply, but it also adds to demand for housing, among other things. And you can't rule out that if those migration numbers are actually what they look like, then that could give housing a second wind. Are people's idea of what a good mortgage rate is? What is a good mortgage rate? 2 years ago, it was 3%. 10 years ago, it was 8% or 7%. When I started as an economist, it was 10%. So those notions of what a fair interest rate is can change, and 8% wage growth might make that change. So the Reserve Bank is quite worried about the possibility that essentially high inflation could become normalised. People work out what the real interest rate is, which at the moment is not that high. I mean, obviously those people have got a legacy of high debt from buying a house in 2021, that those high rates are very painful. But if you're looking at buying a house that's 15, 20% cheaper, and you're expecting wage growth of 5 or 7% rather than 1 or 2%, then your idea of what a good interest rate is could change. I mean, houses still sold in the 1970s when interest rates were 20%. People, of course, couldn't borrow nearly as much money as they could now relative to their real income, which is why we're seeing house prices fall. There's plenty of true believers in the housing market, but their ability to take a punt is being constrained by the fact that interest rates are going up. So just mechanically, the maximum amount you can borrow relative to your income is coming down. But the government is talking about streamlining immigration to help the rebuild effort based on the lessons from Christchurch. Makes perfect sense. It's not easy to magic up infrastructure workers out of your existing population. But of course, there's going to be massive global competition for precisely those resources. Look at Australia. They've got a massive flood cleanup effort going on as well, for example, all over the place. So does the Reserve Bank have its foot on the accelerator or the brake? You would think that was a relatively simple question, but the short answer is they don't know. Their best guess is that it's on the brake, that the neutral OCR is 3.6. The OCR is currently 475. So that's a pretty firm foot on the brake, but it could be as high as 5.4, in which case their foot is still lightly on the accelerator. And regardless of whether it's on the accelerator or the brake, it takes about 18 months or more to have its full effect. So not only can you not see what pedal you're on, you're driving looking in the rear vision mirror. So very, very challenging to engineer a soft landing, mixing up my cars and my planes here, in that scenario. So there are some people saying they've already overdone it. They've already, I don't know, driven the car off the cliff or something. But my feeling is that they probably still haven't done enough. They've done enough to slow the economy, but have they done enough to get inflation down from 7.2 to 2? I don't think so. So we've got a couple more hikes in there with the risk of more. The other thing is that people, the markets in particular, but we've got decades of experience of central banks going, oh my goodness, with the economy's in recession, we've got to do everything we can to get out of it as fast as possible. So they cut rates. And fiscal policy leaps into action, partly automated, partly manual, and tries to get the economy out of that hole as fast as possible. This time, monetary policy is deliberately driving us into a slowdown. It's a feature, not a bug of monetary policy. So the market expectations that central banks are going to start easing the minute it looks like economies are meaningfully slowing. I mean, why would they? This is what they actually wanted to happen to get inflation down. So we've been arguing for a long time that market expectations that rates are going to be cut in the second half of this year are a little bit heroic. I'm running out of time, but essentially through the stable inflation period, you can see I've just used the floating mortgage rate here because there's a nice long history, higher than inflation throughout. So that's positive, real positive interest rates, positive real interest rates. In the 60s and 70s, inflation was often higher than interest rates. So really through that period, you had an incentive to borrow as much as the bank would lend you because inflation would inflate it away. We are at risk of being back in that world, but in our forecasts, we do return to positive real interest rates, but it's mostly by inflation falling rather than by the OCR going up a lot more. The upshot is if inflation doesn't fall as far or as fast as we've got, and it's pretty much a beautiful inverted parabola falling about as fast as it went up, then the OCR is going to have to do the work of delivering those positive real interest rates. So this is just another way of saying people's idea of what a good interest rate is will change if inflation stays high. So, I mean, basically talking about here the risk that the Reserve Bank will just have to keep delivering top-up hikes for a long time to come. Not that they're going to be raising rates double or triple, but that they're just going to be constantly playing a game of catch-up with inflation becoming normalised into expectations and into ideas of what a good interest rate is or a good wage settlement is, for example. So, you know, if inflation got stuck at 5, then the OCR is getting stuck at 7 or 8. You know, it's not a given that inflation is going to drop back to 2, so it's not a given that the OCR is going to top out with a 5 in front of it, not at all. Household debt is actually around where it peaked at the end of the last cycle, which is quite remarkable when you consider we've just had the biggest housing boom in our history. And the reason is largely that the deflator, the denominators move so much. Employment's grown, wages have grown. So really you have to look at debt relative to total household income. So, and also bank lending has been really quite prudent in recent years, partly prudence born of experience, partly the LVR restrictions. So the upshot is that if we've got debt the same as 08, why isn't the OCR going to 825 like it did then? Why isn't it going to more? We've got lower unemployment, higher inflation, higher wage growth, and it could. It absolutely could. It's not our expectation though, because the housing market is in full retreat. Whereas in that 07 period, it was just bulletproof. It was very hard to rein in. But it's just a bit of a reality check. It is not true that the government is that the Reserve Bank is putting an unprecedented burden on households. Of course, there's a distribution of debt, and we've got a chunk of it that is getting pretty stressed out. The people who bought a house at the peak and are now in negative equity and have large debt. But the Reserve Bank sets monetary policy for the median average household who's actually still fine. Of course, it takes a long time for mortgage rates to feed through to everyone. The effective mortgage rates somewhere between 4.3 to 4.5. That will continue to increase and it will suck money out of the economy. But on our forecast, it'll take that debt servicing ratio, that light blue line in this chart, to about 10 or 11. It peaked at 16 in 2008. So here you can see people have still been spending, even though they've been saying it's a terrible time to spend. And I think that comes down to that labour market. And in particular, if you add together the unemployment rate and the inflation rate, then it explains why consumer confidence has tanked. But inflation, while it's deeply annoying, it's not a reason not to spend all your money, just get less for it. Unemployment, the fear of it or the actuality of it, is a very good reason not to spend all your money. And so I think that's why the fall in consumer confidence has overstated the fall in spending, and any bounce we get in consumer confidence will probably overstate the recovery in household spending too. Housing market, you can see it's been a wild ride, biggest in our history, biggest housing boom. Now we're having the biggest housing bust, that's fair. We're forecasting -22, that's a soft landing, because it would take real house prices just a bit lower than they were pre-COVID. If you look at house prices relative to rents or household income, we could go a lot lower than the 2018 levels. You look at 1998, for example. And we shouldn't forget that before COVID, we were having debates about how unaffordable houses were. Few green shoots in the housing market appearing, anecdotally, and in the likes of the auction clearance rate. Very noisy data, though, as you can see. Wouldn't want to read too much into it. But green shoots, Reserve Bank will bring out the roundup. They won't have tolerance for that. The construction sector anecdote and our survey suggests, the jobs are pipeline's running pretty dry, and that makes a lot of sense. Very hard to make the maths work for a new build now. We'd love to have more construction sector respondents in our survey. Construction sector most rate sensitive, so it led the charge out of COVID, and it's leading the downswing. That makes perfect sense. That's employment intentions, construction in the dark blue. And finally, we got through COVID in better shape than most, with low unemployment and GDP bounce back. But we shouldn't forget we did it by borrowing from our own futures, and in particular from millennials' futures. You can see here the increase in debt across the economy, and that's been seen globally. Now, our government debt is still low in a global comparison, but a few more cyclones and the Alpine Fault going, and it won't be. We've also got demographic challenges as well with an ageing population. So we do need that fiscal headroom, every bit of it that we've got. But the good news is we still have that fiscal headroom. A few countries are starting to knock at the edges of that. And that reminds me of the little dirty little secret about inflation. It does inflate away debt, whether you're a householder or a government. And it also eases relative price moves. And we've seen that in housing. House prices are down 15, but real house prices are down more like 25. So we're getting some, not for free, to ask anyone who's looking at a much higher mortgage rate, but certainly it's the less painful adjustment than if nominal house prices had to do all the work, putting lots of people into a negative equity situation. So finally, just for those of you who are not watching this live, on the left is another way you can sign up for our survey. Point your phone at that, or just go email nzeconomics@anz.com. And on the right-hand side, you can sign up directly. We've got a self-service portal for our research. Not all of it's available to everyone, but a lot is. So again, if you prefer to just pen and paper, research.anz.com, or you can point your phone at that QR code. And I will stop there, and I'll stop sharing in just a moment after you've all had a chance to jot those addresses down.
Hey, that's been great, Sharon. Thank you. And I guess people were probably hoping to hear a little bit better news on where the interest rates are heading, but it's the reality of where we're in. And I think the lesson that you gave everyone in terms of inflation and breaking it down for businesses is quite, is really quite useful. And those labour challenges, we see it in the bank. It's challenging at the moment to keep hold of good staff, and so you're always thinking about what are things you can do to support your people. Make sure that they feel like they're a real big part of your team, and keep looking after your staff. They're critical at the moment. And look, if we just go back to this webinar was all about having financial resilience and what you can do to help get through in the current environment that we're in. And we want you to think about things like help strengthen your financial resilience. Make sure you use things like the government support that's that's out there, and Sharon talked about risks. Understand your risks in the business that you've got and plan for the unexpected, and lean on your bank, lean on us. You know, when sudden unpredictable events bring financial pressure, it's really important to have systems and processes in place to respond, like tackling cash flow and getting access to capital and stay on top of your finances. What we are seeing in response to the cyclone is that business customers are saying, actually, when I look to the future, I need solar panels, I need to be self-sufficient. So, you know, there's been this push towards sustainability, but actually part of it is also, how can I keep my business running in disaster, you know, when I'm hit with some kind of disaster, and we have to plan for that. You know, have a plan within a really achievable goal and speak with your advisors on it. That's what they're there to do, help you to make those decisions and set goals that are realistic for your business. Make sure you manage your cash flow really well. Review, you know, your existing business facilities with your ANZ relationship managers. Our team is here to make sure we can help support you, and think about structuring. Structuring at the moment is really key. As you go forward, you know, what can we do to make sure the structure is affordable for what your current position is? The other thing I was going to mention is visit our ANZ's Biz Hub for tools and resources to help you, and make sure you look after yourself and your staff. You might like to watch or listen to a business resilience and wellbeing webinar. We had one recently with Rob Beard of Beard Brothers Small Goods, and Rob is one of the many people impacted by the cyclone and has been incredibly active in the local community down there. So look, we'll share the links with you in the follow-up email with the recording of today's session. But you know, as we mentioned at the start, Sharon and I will try and tackle some questions for you. So we've got a few that were sort of submitted before the webinar, so we might kick off with a couple of them, and I'm going to go straight to you, Sharon. How do we best forecast the US dollar at the moment?
Yeah, the US dollar is always a tricky one. People talk about the US dollar smile, and that is that the US dollar tends to do really well when the US economy is doing really well, and it tends to do really well when the US economy is doing really badly, because then it becomes the safe haven. So we saw that, the peak of that really in the subprime crisis. The problems originated in the US housing market, and everyone fled to the US dollar. It's like, let's put our money in that burning house. So I guess that there is a bit of that going on at the moment too, but also, well, it could be a bit of both, actually, both ends of the smile, because global growth has been going better than expected, but that is a mixed blessing in a world where central banks are trying to slow growth down. So just as we had a long period where bad news was good news during the COVID pandemic for equities and house prices and other asset prices, at least, because it meant that central banks would keep their foot flat to the floor, now we're in this weird opposing world where good news about employment, for example, is now bad news, because it means central banks are going to keep hiking. So the US dollar tends to get a bit of both. It tends to suffer when we're somewhere in the middle, where things are sort of meandering along. We haven't had a lot of meandering in the last few years. It's kind of been a wild roller coaster, I would say. So in that kind of environment, the US is a pretty logical place to park your money, I would say. One of the most interesting developments at the moment in the FX space is actually the Japanese yen, because they've been in full denial that they're ever going to have inflation, and they've been really artificially holding down their bond yields way below everyone else's. And so as a result, all the Japanese savers' money, and there's a lot of it, has been all around the world, in the US and New Zealand and Australia, keeping all our bond yields lower because they're funding our deficits. And now the big risk is that they're going to be forced to face reality and let their yields rise, and that money is going to come back. And so you could see that hit a lot of different currencies, actually, and cause quite a lot of large movements in FX. But while I'm happy to predict volatility, I find it much harder to predict anything else, because the thing in terms of specifics, because the thing about FX is that everything that everyone is expecting is in the price today. It is the most liquid market that there is, and that's what makes FX rates so difficult to forecast. You're basically forecasting surprises.
Hey, so there's a few questions here where people are asking you for a few predictions. So I'm going to chuck a couple more at you. Just the general economic prediction for the manufacturing sector, how do you see that travelling?
Yeah, so the manufacturing sector in New Zealand is largely made up of those related to residential construction and those related to food. And then there's some niche, funky stuff happening in electronics and Christchurch and a few other places, but largely it's building products and food. So building products obviously are really feeling the slowdown in the pipeline for residential construction and the build up in inventories for building products that happened through that period where there were such shortages. So we've got a bit of what's known as a bullwhip effect going on there, where you get a surge and then a plunge in orders as everyone tries to manage the cycle, as it were. So yeah, anecdotally, that part of the manufacturing sector is slowing pretty markedly, and that makes a lot of sense. If you manufacture carpets, you're probably going to do all right out of the flood, for example. So there's a few pockets. A lot of people need a lot of jibboard, but generally speaking, I would expect that to be swamped by the overall business cycle. Food, I'm more positive about, I would say. Obviously the food prices have been hit by negative supply shocks in terms of manufacturing. So, if your business is putting fruit in a can, then, your volumes are going to be lower, obviously, because the yields are going to be lower for some regions. But this world's got increasing food security issues. So might not always be at the price we want, but there will always be a market for our food. I'm no doubt about that at all. And some food is what economists happily call an inferior good, which is that demand for it goes up when people are being more cautious with their spending. So I don't want to offend anyone who makes sausages, but sausages would be the classic example instead of steak, that sort of thing. So there's always opportunities.
Yeah, there's always opportunities. There's a few questions on interest rates, but I think you've covered, where you see the interest rates peaking and what's the greatest influence on this. I think you've covered that. But question here on where is the agriculture sector placed for the next 5 years globally in terms of demand?
Yeah, so obviously the agricultural sector's got some significant challenges. In our business outlook survey, they've got the highest expected costs and the lowest expected pricing intentions. But I think for the agri sector, you can better interpret that as price expectations, because they don't get to set their prices, basically. They're just presented with them. And so clearly margin squeeze going on there. The break-even dairy price is much higher now, for example, and that is a global phenomenon. The Russia invasion of Ukraine has really tightened up the global supply of fertilizer, for example, and it's hard to see that easing up anytime soon. At the end of the day, we've got land and we've got water, but we need fuel and we need fertilizer. So we are very exposed to those higher global costs of production, like everyone else. But we do have an advantage, I would say, in that our pastoral grass-based system provides us a degree of insulation from global grain markets, which also came under pressure when Ukraine was invaded. Global growth, as I said, has been surprisingly resilient. Consumers are still spending, labour markets are still staying tight. But insofar as central banks are determined to cause a slowdown and definitely have the weapons to do it, then it can only really be seen as a temporary reprieve, I would say. There are definitely risks that things go off the rails. We've had a very long period of practically free money. And we know from the experience leading up to 2008 that if you make money free for long enough, people do dumb stuff with it. That's just what you'd expect. And I'd say we haven't really yet seen the full unwinding of that. So that's sitting out there as a downside risk. But generally speaking, I'd say being a food producing nation is a pretty good bet in this kind of environment, just as it was actually in 2008. At the end of the day, people don't need to have a new car, but they do have to eat. So I'm actually quite optimistic. Obviously, there's geopolitical tensions with China, but when China got miffed at Australia, they put taxes on wine and crayfish, not on iron ore. And similarly, they need our milk powder, they need our meat. They've got food security issues. It's a very symbiotic, mutually advantageous trade relationship that I would expect to be pretty robust. That said, the worse the US and China are getting on, the more difficult our position becomes, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. There's a question here around how do you see the current economic situation in 2023 outlook impacting people's confidence to either purchase a business or acquire another to grow or diversify? And look, if I look at that, and I was just catching up with my team earlier today, we're still seeing quite a bit of activity around acquisitions and people still looking to grow. So, pockets of New Zealand are really challenged at the moment, but we're definitely seeing places around New Zealand where there are people looking to really grow by acquiring like businesses or businesses that add more value to their customer proposition down the track. That's certainly what we're seeing. I don't know, Sharon, if you're seeing much in that space around M&A type activity. And
I think you probably in your position have better insights into that than I do.
Yeah. There's also a question here about what is ANZ doing to support customers in the current rising interest rate environment. And look, I think there's a few things. The first thing, and I mentioned it earlier, make sure you get in contact with your relationship managers. The key for us is how do we make sure the structure that you've got on your facilities is best suited to what you're doing? How do you look at the risks in your businesses? So what's your composition of fixed and floating facilities that you have? And then also, we're happy to look at each business on its own merits and just work out, what's your current debt appetite that you've got? Is there more that can be done? Sometimes it's about equity and how might we be able to, connect you with other people that could help as well. So there's a lot we can do, but it's not about us putting out a big statement to say, here's all the various things. It's actually about us sitting down with you. The key for us is getting to really know you, understand your business, have a really strong relationship with you, and then work through how you get through this cycle. And, these are cycles. We've seen them all before. And I think you saw from Sharon's graphs as well. There's, we go through these ups and downs. We go into a recessionary period and we come out the other end of it. And it's just about how we actually support through that, which is a big part of what we do every day. So look, my biggest call out will be talk to us and again, talk to your advisors, use your accountants, your solicitors, they're there to support you, your farm advisors. There's a lot of people around there, around the business community to help you through. There's another question here, Sharon. What is ANZ seeing as the outlook for wage inflation versus general inflation in the current economic environment?
Well, given the labour market is so tight and workers are so hard to find, you would expect real wage growth, and that is indeed what we're seeing. Average hourly earnings are up around 8.5% on a year ago, whereas inflation is running at a bit over 7%. So that average worker is keeping their head above water, unless they have a large mortgage, of course. So we do have wage inflation dropping away because we do have the unemployment rate rising reasonably quickly. We've got it happening a few months later than the Reserve Bank does, but we do have a very marked slowdown in the likes of discretionary retail spending and ongoing falls in house prices that do percolate through the economy and see that unemployment rise, and that takes the heat out of the wages. The most important driver of wages is not what the new guy gets, but rather what you feel you have to pay your current staff to keep them, because obviously that's the sort of stock of wages as opposed to the churn. Though the churn has definitely picked up, and the Reserve Bank's been talking about that a lot in their monetary policy statement, because that does grease the wheels of wage increases across the board, really. And they looked at some pretty cool job-to-job transition data, which showed that people are getting wage increases more often, and that large wage increases are becoming more common. So they're obviously a little concerned about that, because wages are typically sort of the last thing to respond. You get influence activity and then employment and then finally wages. So once they've got a head of steam up, it can be a bit hard to rein it in. Of course, wage increases would seem only fair in a world with high inflation and labour shortages, and indeed it is. But the risk is you can end up in a kind of a ratcheting spiral where no one's actually getting any better off over sort of medium term, and rather caught in an endless game of catch up with arbitrary winners and losers, really. So that's the situation the Reserve Bank is trying to avoid. But they're asking us to take short-term pain for a long-term gain, and humans aren't great at that as a rule. So there's plenty of noise about whether they're doing the right thing, and fair enough too.
Yeah, agree. And just to follow on with that, what would a sustainable non-inflationary increase in immigration look like?
Well, yeah, bring them in, put them in tents, work them to death, and then send them away again. That's the brutal truth, isn't it? If you want to actually treat them like human beings and give them a nice place to live and a decent wage that they can happily spend and all that sort of thing, it can actually become inflationary. And of course, if they stay and they bring their families, then it adds a lot more to demand. So there is a genuine trade-off there between the hard-nosed economic benefit and the doing the right thing. Absolutely. But I would hope we choose to do the right thing. But the main thing is to absolutely laser focus, match the skills that we're bringing in with the skills that we need. Right at the moment, we need every type of skill there is. So it's maybe not so challenging at the moment. But it's going to, clearly the infrastructure space is going to be a real logjam, bottleneck for the economy.
Yeah. That's the biggest one, isn't it? That whole supply chain disruption with the way that the roading system's looking at the moment in New Zealand will continue to really challenge us. Yeah. We've got another question. What more can ANZ do to support cyclone hit agricultural businesses? Hey, look, we're looking really closely at this at the moment, and one of the things we learn from history and what we've done in the past. And if I reflect on PSA is a good example. When there was a major disaster in the kiwi fruit sector, one of the things we tend to do is actually step back and make sure we understand what the key problems are for our customers. So at the moment, in terms of the impact from Gabrielle, our teams are out talking to all our customers in the sector that that have been hit, especially in the agriculture sector, the horticulture. There's some real challenges there, and we've announced some initial packages, but we're still working on what is going to be needed and where do we best place our support. So you would have seen that we have pledged $3 million to help support the sort of rebuild. But what we are going to do with that money is actually stop and really make sure we understand where it's best needed. So we're working through that process at the moment, and our teams on the ground are helping us sort of work through what is going to be needed to support everyone. So what I would say is, we've done some initial support packages. We've done the 50,000, 0% interest rate for just to get people through that initial stage, and then we're going to look at what more we do as a bank. So it's definitely a work in progress at the moment, is what I would say on that one. So I think, Sharon, that might be all our questions. There was one here: when are interest rates going to come down, and do we need to put the country into recession to bring inflation under control if there aren't any other methods? Kind of touched on that, I would say.
Yeah, well, the only other thing sort of policymakers can do would be the government spending an awful lot less, that tight fiscal policy. Hard to see that happening. Not only is it an election year, but clearly, the cyclone and the needs for support from that are enormous as well. So, hard to see fiscal prudence being a big part of bringing inflation pressure down over the next year or two, really, in this kind of environment. Fiscal policy is the right tool for disaster relief. Monetary policy can only be really broad. It can only impact generalised demand, and it's not clear, for example, how rebooting the Auckland housing market would help Napier at the moment, for example. So fiscal policy definitely has a role to play, but it's probably not going to be a disinflationary role, which does, leave the central bank kind of on its own a little bit in that regard. It's I would expect the noise around rate hikes to get louder as it becomes more evident that they are slowing the economy. We're still at the early stages of that, but you can see it in the data. But the Reserve Bank will be weighing up the risk of doing too much and causing a harder landing, and then they were saying, well, we can always cut rates again if necessary, a bit of unnecessary volatility, but we can fix that, versus being too slow to raise rates and losing their credibility. If I remember when a cartoon from when inflation targeting started, had a little flying pig with 2% written on the side. If no one believes inflation is going to get down to anything remotely like that, then your job of getting it down becomes much, much more difficult. And it took a 1991 recession with unemployment rate well into the double digits. It wasn't deliberate, but you don't want to be in a world where that's the sort of thing that it would take to get inflation down. So the risks on the two sides are not really comparable. So you put that together and you end up with them saying, well, if they haven't already caused a hard landing, we just don't know about it yet, then they're still likely to, because they're kind of having to weigh up those type 1, type 2 errors, and one's unfortunate and one's catastrophic from where they sit.
Hey, so change of tact completely. I might answer this first and then you can give us your top 2 tips. So with International Women's Day coming up, what's your top 2 tips for women operating in the current business environment? So for me, I would say have a really strong belief in what you're doing and use people around you to support you when you're running your business, because having run a small business myself, I know often you'll sit at home around the dinner table trying to make decisions on what you might and might not do, but actually there's multiple people facing very similar challenges with you. They might be selling different products or services or goods, but the problems you're trying to solve will be very similar. So use the network of people around you. If you don't have big enough networks, then use places like us, use your bankers who have got big networks, use your professionals to actually find people that can help you solve some of the problems. And one thing that works well for us is actually connecting business owners with business owners to help them solve problems. So that would be one of my top tips as a female. And then the second one would be, you know, I think you're always capable of more than you think or believe you're capable of doing. So when you're running a business, just be really proud of what you do and you know, have the confidence to believe in what you're doing. But Sharon, what about you? What would your 2 top tips be?
Well, I'm the only person in my family who doesn't run a business. I remember my dad telling me he'd be disappointed if I never ran a business. So I might have to start a little mail order thing in my retirement, perhaps. But women, go to the doctor. You know, men bury their head in the sand. I reckon actually women business owners, if they just apply that principle, find out what the problem is and fix it early, that applies to small businesses in challenging times as well as your health, I would say. So yeah, just run with that.
Yeah, good advice. Hey, well, look, we are at time a little. So look, as we close today's webinar, I just want to reassure everyone that our business customers, we're here to help you, and there are a range of support options available to you, including those customers who are in those weather impacted regions, as we've touched on. We will follow up with a recording of the webinar shortly with links to the useful resources that I've touched on. So look, thanks everyone for taking the time to join us today. We hope you found the session useful.